This past week, there was an occasion that was taken note of, commemorated, particularly in the Orthodox synagogues around the world, a day that the Jews called Tish B'Av, or the 9th of Ab. It was a day that Orthodox Jews, if they were strictly observant, it was a day that they passed in fasting, and there was a particular book of the Bible that they read, that they focused on. Now, this particular occasion is certainly not commanded in the Bible, but it is mentioned, and there's a question that is asked concerning this particular occasion, and a question that is found in the book of Zechariah. And I want to focus our attention a little bit on that, on some of the things that are connected with that, because I would like for us to focus our attention a little bit on a book of the Bible that we often don't spend a lot of time on. People sort of look at it and thumb through it, and yet it's a book that not only is concerned with history, but it is also a book that is concerned with the future. But before we get to that, let's go back to the book of Zechariah. Now, set the stage a little bit for Zechariah. Zechariah, of course, was one of the prophets that accompanied Zerubbabel when he returned to rebuild Jerusalem. You remember the story that Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judah beginning about 604 BC. There were 3 invasions. He came in about 604, came back about 597, and then finally came back in 586 and destroyed Jerusalem, burned the temple, destroyed everything, and took the whole group into captivity. Now, the first invasion, he took a small number into captivity. That group included Daniel and his friends. When he came back the second time in 597, he took the king, Jehoiakim, he took him into captivity, took him to Babylon. Ezekiel and others were taken into captivity at that time, the second captivity. And then the final captivity that occurred just a matter of years later, just over a decade later, when he came back, and this time the city itself was totally destroyed. It was burned to the ground. The temple was destroyed. Much of the population was taken into captivity. Now, this seemed to mark the end of the Jewish state, to mark the end of Jerusalem, to mark the end of the Jewish temple. But that didn't prove to be the case, because within a matter of decades, as recorded in the book of Daniel, Babylon itself fell. The great city that seemingly was going to be able to rule the world, put together this vast empire in the lifetime of one person, in the lifetime of Daniel himself. From the time Daniel went into captivity until the fall of Babylon was about 65, 66 years. Not that long a period of time. Daniel saw the initial captivity as a young man, a young teenager, maybe around 15 or so, and by the time he was 80 or 81, he had lived to see the fall of the Babylonian state. Well, a few years later, King Cyrus the Great, the ruler of the Persians who had conquered Babylon, issued a decree, and he allowed the Jews now to return from Babylonian captivity and to rebuild Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. And Zerubbabel was appointed the governor under the Persian government, and he went back, and he was accompanied by Zechariah and Haggai, prophets of God. And they went back, and they were involved in this project of rebuilding. Now, in Zechariah chapter 7, we pick up the story, and as the timing here of Zechariah chapter 7 is in the 4th year, Zechariah 7:1, in the 4th year of King Darius. The word of the Lord came unto Zechariah in the 4th day of the 9th month, even Keslev. That would be approximately December, end of November, beginning of December. The 4th year of King Darius would date to about 516 BC, and I'll show you that just a little bit down here in this section. On this particular occasion, 2 men came to the temple, along with some of their followers, and they came, verse 3, to ask a question. They came to speak unto the priests that were in the house of the Lord and unto the prophets. And they had a question. They wanted to know if they should continue to lament and mourn in the 5th month, separating myself as I have all these years. And the word of the Lord of hosts came unto me, saying, Zechariah is standing there, Joshua the high priest, various ones. These men come in, they have their query. They're saying, should we continue this custom, this practice of mourning and lamenting every year during the 5th month, separating ourselves in that way? God's word came to Zechariah, and he spoke out, and God told him, he said, speak unto all the people of the land and to the priests, saying, when you mourned and fasted in the 5th and 7th month, even those 70 years, did you at all fast unto me, even to me? A period of 70 years from the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 brings us down to 516. Now, it mentions here a fasting, a time of fasting, mourning, lamenting in the 5th month and in the 7th month. This is something that had been going on for the last 70 years. And their question is, should we continue that? Now, there's a reason why they asked that question. God, of course, returned the question to them by saying, when you were doing this all these 70 years, were you really doing it to me? Were you doing it the right way for the right reason, or were you simply going through the motions of something? Now, if you want to understand what this reference is to a fast in the 5th month and in the 7th month, these were dates that commemorated an anniversary. If you go back to 2 Kings 25, 2 Kings 25, you find that Nebuchadnezzar came up against Jerusalem in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign. In verse 2, it was besieged unto the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And on the 9th day of the 4th month, a famine prevailed in the city. There was no bread. There had been a siege that had lasted for about a year and a half, a little over a year and a half, almost 2 years. And when we come up now to the 4th month, right here, the 9th day of the 4th month, we're told that famine prevailed. Food had been growing steadily scarcer during this period of about 20 months as the city was being besieged by Nebuchadnezzar's army. And now, here in the early part of the 4th month, famine prevailed. There was no more bread. Well, the city was broken up, and some of the leaders tried to escape by night, take a secret way out. They were captured. Zedekiah, the king, had his sons were slain, and he was blinded and carried to Babylon. Now, notice verse 8. In the 5th month, on the 7th day of the month, this is the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar's general came into Jerusalem, verse 9, and he burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem. And every great man's house he burnt with fire. And they broke down the walls of Jerusalem round about. And there was this great remnant that were going to be carried away to Babylonian captivity. Now we're told here, you just hold your spot because we're going to come right back. We're told this is dated to the 5th month on the 7th day of the month. If you go back to Jeremiah's account, remember Jeremiah lived through these events. Jeremiah was present in Jerusalem during all of these events. And in Jeremiah chapter 52, we're told a parallel account of the same thing. And in verse 12 of Jeremiah 52, in the 5th month, in the 10th day of the month. It mentions that the Nebuchadnezzar's general, verse 13, burned the house of the Lord and the king's house and all the houses of Jerusalem and all the houses of the great men burned with fire. Now, Jeremiah says it was the 10th day of the 5th month, and 2 Kings says it was the 7th day of the 5th month. I think the logical way to put those two accounts together is the realization that if you break all the walls of the city down and you burn the palace and you burn the temple and you burn all the houses, that you're talking of something that lasts for several days. They didn't bring in bulldozers, when they broke down the walls. Lasts for several days. Evidently, it started on the 7th day and it ended on the 10th day. According to Jewish tradition, the Bible does not actually name that day, but according to Jewish tradition, it was on the 9th day of the 5th month, partway through that 4-day spread. It was on the 9th day of the 5th month that the temple itself caught up on flames and burned over the course of the next 2 days until it was absolutely, totally destroyed, burning on the 9th and the 10th day of the 5th month. Now, the Jews, needless to say, this was the most catastrophic of events that could be imagined. And it was an anniversary, and it was an anniversary that was commemorated, and the Jews began the practice of commemorating this anniversary right away. From year one on, they commemorated this anniversary with a day of fasting on the 9th day of the 5th month. Now, you remember the question back in Zechariah? He says we've been mourning and lamenting in the 5th month and in the 7th month. Well, clearly this period of lamentation in the 5th month is the anniversary of the temple's destruction. That's mentioned in 2 Kings 25. Well, if you go on down through the account in 2 Kings 25, you'll find that while most of the people were taken into captivity and the city of Jerusalem was totally destroyed, that there were individuals left behind. Generally, the poor people and just those who were the sort of the bottom rung of society. There were a number of those that were left behind, and a governor was appointed. The Babylonians appointed a man by the name of Gedaliah, who, as you read the account, more details of Gedaliah are given in the book of Jeremiah, and he was evidently a devout man, a sincere man, and he was appointed by the Babylonians to govern Judah. Well, 2 Kings 25 tells us in verse 22, as for the people that remained in the land of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had left, even over them he made Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, ruler. And it mentions in verse 25, just a few weeks later, it came to pass in the 7th month that Ishmael came with these men, and he smote Gedaliah that he died. And it was a very treacherous situation. More details are recounted in the book of Jeremiah. And then, verse 26, all the people, small and great, and the captains of the armies, arose and came to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. You better believe they were afraid of the Chaldeans. They just assassinated the governor. So they better be afraid of the Chaldeans. So their solution, and again, more details are given in the book of Jeremiah, because they even captured Jeremiah and they hauled him off down to Egypt. See, Jeremiah told them, he said, God says, if you'll stay here and you'll do what you need to do, God will take care of you. You'll be protected. But they didn't believe that. Hadn't believed anything Jeremiah told them. So they said, we've got a solution. We're going to assassinate the governor, and then we're going to take off to Egypt, and the Egyptians will protect us. Well, that was not a particularly smart move, because just not very many years later, Nebuchadnezzar showed up with an army down to Egypt, and Egypt fell. And he came in and killed the king of Egypt and took the Egyptians into captivity. And there was a great calamity that befell those who had gone to Egypt. Well, the Jews in Babylonian captivity then recognized 2 dates. One date was in the 5th month, the 9th day of the 5th month. They commemorated as a day of fasting. It was the anniversary of the temple's destruction. A matter of a few weeks later, during the 7th month, actually on a date that comes between trumpets and atonement, they commemorated a second anniversary, and that was the anniversary of Gedaliah's assassination, which brought more trouble on them. and was a terrible event. As you read of it in Jeremiah, it was a very treacherous event against a man who was clearly a decent man and the only one that was really listening to what Jeremiah had to say. And this treacherous Ishmael and his cohorts came in and assassinated. And so these events had been commemorated. And now as these individuals come into the temple, because now you see Jerusalem is in the process of being rebuilt. Much of the city still lays waste, but they're in the process of doing some building, and the temple has basically been built back to the point that it's usable again. And so now a couple of individuals show up there in the temple. This has been 70 years since the destruction of Jerusalem. And their question was to the priests and to Zechariah the prophet and others who were there, should we continue? You know, for the last 70 years, we've been mourning and lamenting in the 5th month and in the 7th month on these anniversaries. Is that something we ought to continue to do? Now, God never told them they had to do that to begin with. That was simply their decision as to how to commemorate those anniversaries. So the question God asks them through Zechariah, end of verse 5, is when you have been fasting and mourning during the 7th month and the 5th month for the last 70 years, did you really fast to me? When you ate and when you drank, were you eating for yourselves and drinking for yourselves? Should you not hear the words which the Lord has cried by the former prophets when Jerusalem was inhabited and in prosperity, and the cities thereof round about her, when men inhabited the south and the plain? And the word of the Lord came to Zechariah, saying, Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, execute true judgment, show mercy and compassion. Don't oppress the widow and the fatherless and the stranger and the poor. Don't imagine evil against your brother in your heart. They refused to hearken. Verse 12, they made their hearts as adamant stone. And so these events came on. The point that Zechariah is making, and part of what is emphasized here, is that while people had gone through the motions of commemorating an anniversary, and they had fasted and they had gone through various things, it was not something that was really accompanied throughout those years by genuine change in the way they did things. Oh, it's one thing to go through ceremony. It's one thing to go through certain forms of religion. It's another thing to get down to actually change the way we live, the way we interact with other people, the way we treat others. And that was what Zechariah reminded him of. He said, your forefathers didn't listen to the prophets that came before. Back when Jerusalem was prosperous, they weren't listening. These things came. You've been fasting for the last 70 years on these anniversaries. But God says, have you really been fasting to me? Has it just been something you've been going through the motions and you've gone through this observance? Now, not only did they, and do they, in the Orthodox communities to this day, commemorate the 9th of Ab with a fast, in conjunction with that fast, they read a particular book of the Bible, and that is the book of Lamentations. Now, if you want the background of the book of Lamentations, let's just notice briefly before we go there. Let's go back to the book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 34. 2 Chronicles, chapter 34. Young Josiah was 8 years of age when he came to the throne, and he reigned for 31 years. In the 8th year of his reign, when he was about 15 or 16, he really began to seek God. And then when he assumed responsibility and full authority in the 12th year of his reign, he would have been about 20, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem from the high places. He began to really clean things up, and he was a very zealous young man. He really desired to please God and to serve God. He came on the heels of the most wicked reign in the history of Judah. His grandfather Manasseh had been on the throne for decades. Manasseh was the most wicked ruler that Judah ever had. And Josiah came on the throne just a couple of years after his grandfather's death, because his father only reigned 2 years, and continued to do the wicked things that Manasseh had done. And Ammon, Josiah's father, was assassinated after a couple of years on the throne, and this little 8-year-old boy came to the throne. Well, he had a heart to really seek God, and he began doing so from the time he was a teenager. In the 18th year of his reign, verse 8, after he had purged much of the land, he began this project of repairing the house of the Lord. And this was evidently begun in the fall, because we find this is in the 18th year of his reign, and they kept a great Passover to God that's described in chapter 35 in the 18th year of his reign. So they began this project of repairing the temple, which has fallen into disrepair. Remember, decades have gone by since the temple has been used for its proper purpose. Manasseh had set up idolatrous shrines all over the city. He had built houses for the sodomites. He would have actually, fit right in on the Supreme Court or on some of the. He'd have been a good fellow. I bet he could have got confirmation if they. You hear about the. Maybe I mentioned this here. The man who's up for judge for Senate confirmation for one of the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. He did a really terrible thing. And just got some of the senators just horror-struck that such a man would be nominated for a judgeship. It seems that back several years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, he was getting ready to take his family on vacation going down to Florida to Disney World. And he had tickets bought, was all set to go, and he found out sort of at the last minute that the particular day he was planning on taking his family to Disney World had been designated as Gay Pride Day at Disney World. So they had, all these queers by the tens of thousands that were flooding the place to celebrate the occasion. And for some strange reason, he decided he didn't want to take his kids down there that day. They'd go to Disney World some other time, but they'd do something else that day. Oh, there have been senators that were just absolutely amazed that, somebody who would do such a terrible thing as that, not want to go and take his kids to Disney World on Gay Pride Day, that he would be nominated for a judgeship. And so they were trying to block that. I think Manasseh could have just, whizzed through the confirmation process. I mean, he built houses for the sodomites, and he was into every sort of idolatry that could be imaginable. I'm sure, he would have been just the sort of guy that they'd be glad to see. Well, God was not glad to see. And so things were in a real mess. And the temple was now in the process of being repaired, and in the process of that, we're told in verse 14 of 2 Chronicles 34 that when they brought out the money that was brought unto the house of the Lord, Hilkiah the priest found a book of the law of the Lord given by Moses. Now, this had evidently been lost. If you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, you find at the end of his life, Moses took the book of the law that he had written, and he gave it to the priests to lay up before the Ark of the Covenant. Now, a long time has passed. We're not told exactly what happened to the book of the law. My thought on it, my idea, maybe you have a different one, but mine is that some priest had probably early on in the reign of Manasseh, when things had taken such a negative turn, had probably hidden the book because he didn't want Manasseh to destroy it. And anyway, regardless of how it got lost, in the process of the temple repair, the book was rediscovered. It was found. And, they had known about some of these things by word of mouth, but the actual account, the book of the law, had been lost for a period of decades. Now it was read, and it was now brought to the king. It was read before young King Josiah. And when Josiah heard it, he rent his garments. He was just sort of awestruck and horrified at what he heard. Now, if you want to know what he heard, just go back and read Deuteronomy 28. Let me just call your attention here to something about Deuteronomy 28. And by the way, there's something about this that we have often overlooked or not particularly commented upon. You notice Deuteronomy 28, it goes through the blessings and the cursings. And when you get to Deuteronomy 29, verse 1, these are the words of the covenant which the Eternal commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant that he made with them in Horeb. So this chapter, Deuteronomy 28, the blessings and the cursings, really represented a second covenant. A covenant that are an additional covenant. It was not a replacement, but it was an additional covenant. It was a covenant made with the generation that was now going to enter into the promised land. It was made not at Horeb, but it was made in the plains of Moab. And it was made with that generation. And basically what it did was that, as you notice in Deuteronomy 28:1, it'll come to pass, if you shall diligently hearken unto the voice of the Eternal your God, to observe and to do all His commandments, which I command you this day, the Lord your God will set you on high above all the nations, and all the blessings shall come upon you. And verse 9, the Lord shall establish you a holy people unto Himself, as He sworn unto you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in all His ways. But He goes on to say in verse 15, if you will not hearken to observe to do the commandments and the statutes that I command you, then all these curses shall come on you and overtake you. And it goes through the remainder of the chapter with curse after curse after curse that would come on them. Well, this is part of what was read to Josiah. And when he listened to what was going to happen, and he knew what the people had been doing, and when he listed, he knew they were in trouble, but he didn't know how much. And at this point, he rent his garments. He was just overwhelmed with what he had heard. And he asked those that were there, the priests and others that were there, to inquire of the Lord as to what was God going to do? Were all these things really going to happen? And the word came back to him. God said that, in verse 27, because your heart was, this is 2 Chronicles 34, because your heart was tender and you humbled yourself when you heard these words. Verse 28, I'm going to gather you to your fathers. I'm going to let you die, and your eyes will not see the evil that I'm going to bring on this place and upon the inhabitants. You're going to go to sleep, you're going to die, and you won't see the fulfillment of these curses. Well, the king, verse 30, went up to the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah and the inhabitants, and he caused to be read in their ears all the words of the book of the covenant that was found in the house of the Lord. The king stood in his place and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep His commandments. Everybody there in Jerusalem, he caused them to stand to it. Now, I think that's sort of the operative phrase. The king made the covenant, and he said, all of you will too, and they all said, yes, sir, we agree. Now, there are times that people go along with something. I think we can look back even in our own lifetime to a time when Mr. Armstrong said he was going to put the church back on the track. And that was certainly what he wanted to do. And he made it very clear that he expected everybody else to do the same thing. And there were all sorts of folks, all sorts of ministers. Yes, sir, boy, we're getting back on the track. That's right. Well, a lot of those folks were just like the ones that stood to the covenant in the days of Josiah. You know that because when you read on down the story, you find, of course, Jeremiah and 2 Chronicles 35, Josiah kept this great Passover and this great event of recommitment and repentance. And then Josiah died. And you find out how long things stayed on track once Josiah died. They didn't stay on track for any length of time. Josiah was succeeded by 4 kings, 3 of them his sons and 1 of them his grandson. And every one, if one could have been worse than his fellows, then it was like they almost just sort of went from bad to worse on the way down. None of them were good kings. None of them walked in the ways of Josiah, and the nation as a whole very quickly departed from the way. They heard the message. Now, I think it's interesting. You realize that I don't want to go through and get bogged down with all of the chronology of it, but in Jeremiah chapter 25, we know when Jeremiah's prophetic ministry began. Verse 3, Jeremiah 25:3. From the 13th year of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, even unto this day. God had been, I've been speaking to you, rising early and speaking, and you haven't listened. Now, if you want to calculate it, you find from the 13th year of Josiah until the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar was about 40 years. During that entire period, and this is only part way through it, at the time this verse was recorded, it was only 23 years into the period, but Jeremiah continued on, and he was there when Jerusalem was destroyed. There was a period of about 40 years that Jeremiah was giving God's message of warning. During a portion of that, King Josiah was giving the message of warning. He called the nation to repentance. He did all the things he could do to clean up. And he demanded that the people make a covenant, renew their covenant with God. And they said, yes, sir. But it obviously didn't go very deep. In fact, as you go through the book of Jeremiah, you find that once Josiah died, Jeremiah had nothing but trouble. Every one of Josiah's sons and his grandson, they weren't interested in really obeying God. Jeremiah was primarily persecuted by the priests and the so-called prophets, the religious leaders. He went through all sorts of things, accused of all sorts of things. But Jeremiah had done something. At the end of 2 Chronicles 35, you read that here in the end of 2 Chronicles 35, that Josiah died. Now, we were told Josiah reigned for 31 years. The great Passover was in the 18th year of his reign. Now, here we are about 13 years later, and Josiah dies. And at the time that he died, it was a terrible tragedy, and nobody understood how terrible that tragedy was more so than Jeremiah. In fact, in 2 Chronicles 35:25, we read that Jeremiah lamented for Josiah. And all the singing men and the singing women spoke of Josiah in their lamentations to this day, and made them an ordinance in Israel, and behold, they are written in the Lamentations. Jeremiah made a lamentation for King Josiah. It was done in poetic meter, set to music, and at the time when Chronicles was put together in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, it had been continued to be sung all the way down to that time. It was made a part of the law in Israel. In other words, it became a part of Scripture. It's written in the Lamentations. Now, it shouldn't be too hard to figure out what that is. If you just go back to the very end of the book of Jeremiah, right at the in most of our English translations, when you get to the very end of Jeremiah, then the next book you read is a little short book called the Lamentations of Jeremiah. So it's sort of funny. Sometimes you read some of the scholars and the commentators, and they're commenting on 2 Chronicles 35, and they're trying to figure out, wonder what happened to this book that Jeremiah wrote. Well, let them turn a few pages, and it shouldn't be too hard to figure out. There is a book that is the Lamentations of Jeremiah, and it is written in a poetic meter form. I'll show you that in just a second. And it is the book, this book of Lamentations is the book that was written in the aftermath of Josiah's death. You see, Jeremiah realized very deeply in a way that the other people did not. The fact that the death of Josiah signaled the death knell of the nation. Because the Word of God was that the nation would be spared during the lifetime of Josiah. But when he died, the curses of the book of the law were going to come. Because God could see, God looks on the heart. And what he could see is that Josiah very sincerely and very devoutly turned to God, and he was seeking God and wanting to serve God. The people, most of them just sort of went with the flow. They weren't really dedicated and zealous to God. They were doing the things that Manasseh allowed them to do when he was king, and when Josiah began to take a tight rein and, quote, put things back on the track, they claimed they were getting back on the track, but they didn't get back on the track in their heart. The evidence of that, if they got anybody who got back on the track in his heart stays on the track when the fellow that pointed out the track is dead, that doesn't alter what you're doing. You read the story of Judah at this time, and it's very apparent that they didn't go through the experience from the heart that Josiah went through. And it's very apparent as we look at our more recent history that there were individuals who paid lip service to certain things, but it clearly did not reflect what was really in their heart, because a few years later, when they got the opportunity, they showed what was in their heart. Now, notice something about the book of Lamentations. If you notice here, it's a little short book, 5 chapters. Now, if you notice, chapters 1 and 2 each have 22 verses. Chapter 3 has 66 verses. Chapters 4 and 5 have 22 verses. Now you may say, well, what's the point of that? 22, 22, and then a multiple, 3 times 22. 22, 22. What's the significance of that? You have, in effect, 7 sections of 22 verses arranged here in these 5 chapters. What's the significance of that? Well, just to explain it to you most briefly, just flip back in your Bible to Psalm 119. And in Psalm 119, you'll notice right under the words Psalm 119, you'll notice a little mark, sort of a little squiggly mark, and it says Aleph. Come down 8 verses, and you notice another little mark, and it says Beth. And then Gimel, and Dalet, and Hey, Vav, Zayin, and you can just come right on down. If you want to count them, you will find there are 22 of them. Those are the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And if you were reading Psalm 119 in Hebrew, what you'd find is the first 8 verses all start with A, and the next 8 verses all start with B, and it runs down through the alphabet. Now, if you go back to the book of Lamentations, what you find is this same kind of poetry. In Lamentations 1 and 2, you have 22 verses each, corresponding to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet in chapters 1 and in chapters 2. Chapter 3 triples that. The first 3 verses are for the first letter. The next 3 verses are for B, and the next 3 verses, and it comes on down. Again, this use of this playing on the letters of the alphabet. And then chapters 4 and 5 are back once again to the letters of the alphabet. Now, the point of that, in Hebrew, there was a sense of completion. Psalm 119, a psalm written in praise of the law, the sense of it was that everything that you could say on that subject was said. The whole alphabet was used up. You used up every letter, and you used up the whole alphabet in praise to the law. So it perfectly, completely summed up that matter. When you get to Lamentations, you find something else that is described completely. Now what you find, of course, is a lament that we're told that Jeremiah composed after the death of King Josiah. It is a lament that describes, that was a prophecy. It was written after Josiah died, and it was a prophecy of what was going to come to pass. And you know, Jeremiah lived to see this prophecy fulfilled, because he was there in Jerusalem. when the city was taken. You can read the story in the book of Jeremiah. He was there in the city when it was taken. He saw the horrible destruction. He saw the fulfillment of these words, because this describes the fulfillment of the curses of Deuteronomy 28. The very things that Josiah had feared, that he tried to turn the nation away from. Notice here in the book of Lamentations, chapter 1, verse 1, how does the city sit solitary that was full of people? How is she become as a widow, she that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces? Verse 2, she weeps sore in the night, her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she has none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They've become her enemies. Judah's gone into captivity because of affliction. Here, this great, prosperous, mighty city is described as empty, solitary, desolate. They thought they had plenty of friends. We've got allies. We've got friends. Our friends will help us. Among all her lovers, she has none to comfort her. Her friends have dealt treacherously with her. All of the allies that Judah trusted to help them out in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, oh, we can withstand the siege. Well, we've got a deal with this country, and we've got an agreement over here, and Pharaoh's going to help us. We heard from him. We've got our friends and our allies, and everything's going to be okay. Well, it wasn't okay. They put their trust in the wrong things. It goes on and describes in verse 5, her adversaries are the chief, her enemies prosper. The Lord has afflicted her for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children are gone into captivity before the enemy. Verse 8, Jerusalem has grievously sinned, therefore she is removed. So we come on down a little further in the chapter, in verse 11, all her people sigh, they seek bread. They have given their pleasant things for food to relieve their soul. You know, those who were rich, indulging in every sort of luxury. You know, when hunger comes, all the gold and all the beautiful paintings and all the beautiful art objects and all of the luxurious things, people would trade all of it for something to eat when they're hungry. That happened in ancient Jerusalem. Verse 15, the Lord has trodden underfoot all your mighty men in the midst. Compares it to being trodden in a winepress here in the end of verse 15. Verse 17, Zion spreads forth her hands, and there's none to comfort her. Verse 19, I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and my elders gave up the ghost in the city while they sought their food to relieve their souls. All these priests and prophets who had been saying, don't pay attention to Jeremiah, don't listen to him. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Everything's going to be okay. Again, you can read their story in the book of Jeremiah. You can read about his confrontations with them. While Judah called for their lovers, their allies, and found out we've been deceived. Why, we thought they were going to come help us. They're not going to do anything. They tricked us. They took our money and then they didn't help out. And all of the folks that were running around saying, oh, it's all going to be okay, nothing's going to happen, they were dying. Well, verse 21 talks about, quote, all my enemies have heard of my trouble and they're glad. If we come on into chapter 2, verse 1, how has the Lord covered the daughter of Zion with a cloud in his anger, and cast down from heaven unto earth the beauty of Israel? Verse 2, the Lord has swallowed up all the habitations of Jacob. Verse 3, he's cut off in his fierce anger all the horn of Israel. He's burned against Jacob like a flaming fire. Verse 5, the Lord was an enemy. He swallowed up Israel. He swallowed up all her palaces. He's increased in the daughter of Judah mourning and lamentation. Now, you notice here there's a mention of both Israel and Judah. There are a couple of places where that's done in the book of Lamentations. And I'm going to show you a little later the real significance of that. But realize at the time Josiah died, the northern nation of Israel, the house of Israel, had been in captivity for over a century. It had been over a century since the Assyrians had taken northern Israel into captivity. It had been over a century that that area had been populated by a different people. Now, as you come down to the destruction of Jerusalem, well over a century has passed. And yet Jeremiah refers in this lament for Josiah to Israel as well as Judah. Well, I'll show you why. Notice verse 6. He says, He's violently taken away his tabernacle, or as the margin renders it, his hedge, as it were of a garden. In ancient times, they hedged the gardens about. They didn't have electric fences put up and keep the deer out. And so what they did was they planted a thorn hedge. And this is a pretty durable form of fence because it would last for generations, and it was trimmed out as a hedge. But it would, get thick, and basically what it served to do was fence off an area, a garden spot, to keep the animals from getting in and eating it up. And so it has to do with a protective hedge. God describes Himself as cutting down the hedge that had hedged the nation about, hedged Israel about. He was going to remove the hedge, which of course would allow the garden to be trampled down and overrun. It goes on and describes in verse 11, Mine eyes do fail with tears, my bowels are troubled, my liver is poured out upon the earth, the destruction of the daughter of my people. Because the children and the sucklings swoon in the streets of the city, they say to their mothers, Where is corn and wine? Where's food? They're fainting. They're starving. Little children. The prophets have seen vain and foolish things. They've not discovered your iniquity to turn away your captivity. They haven't told the truth. The leaders of organized religion have not told the people why these things were going to happen. They've seen vain and foolish things. They've painted a rosy picture that was not going to take place. Well, it is described here as the day of the Lord's anger. Verse 22. In chapter 3 and verse 1, I am the man that has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He's led me and brought me into darkness, but not into light. And yet, he describes in verse 17, You've removed my soul far off from peace. I forgot prosperity. I said, My strength and my hope is perished from the Lord. Verse 20, My soul has them in remembrance and is humbled in me. This I recall to my mind, therefore have I hope. Now what you find in chapter 3, now as an inset, chapters 1 and 2 give you this lament or one problem followed by another problem, followed by another problem. Chapter 3 focuses on the problems, but it shows that the lament is not a hopeless lament. Because in the midst of the lament, he says, I'm humbled. I'm remembering all these things, verse 20, and it humbles me. And then I recall this to mind, and I have hope. Verse 22, it's of the Lord's mercies that we're not consumed, because His compassions fail not. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore will I hope in Him. The Lord is good unto them that wait for Him, and to the soul that seeks Him. It is good that a man should have hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord. So in the midst of this terrible lament for calamity upon calamity upon calamity, it's not a hopeless lament. It's not everything is lost and gone forever. In the midst of calamity, hope is rediscovered. That hope rests upon the faithfulness of God. It rests upon God's mercy. Interestingly, verse 30, he gives his cheek to him that smites him. He's filled full with reproach. Now, if you're aware, of course, this verse is quoted back in the New Testament. He gives his cheek to the smiters, and reference to Christ. You see, he went through a time of terrible travail, and yet, for all the time that his enemies around were saying, we've got it taken care of, we're getting rid of him, we won't have to be bothered with him again. They, of course, had lost sight, or never grasped, that what he was suffering, the lament he was suffering, was not hopeless. Yes, they brought him down to the grave, but 3 days and 3 nights he came out of the grave. All right, God, in dealing with Judah here, in the midst of this prophecy, this lament, there was hope. The Lord will not cast off forever, verse 31. Though he cause grief, yet will he have compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. For he does not afflict willingly, nor grieve the children of men. God doesn't enjoy that. God doesn't take pleasure in bringing people down and causing grief. He will not cast off forever. He doesn't afflict willingly. There's hope in the midst of the lament. As we come on a little further, verse 39, wherefore does a living man complain, a man for the punishment of his sins? Let us search and try our ways and turn again to the Lord. Let us lift up our heart with our hands unto God in the heavens. We've transgressed and have rebelled. You've not pardoned. You've covered with anger and persecuted us. So, in verse 55, I called upon your name, O Lord, out of the low dungeon. You have heard my voice. Hide not your ear at my breathing, at my cry. You draw near in the day that I called upon you. You said, fear not. O Lord, you have pleaded the causes of my soul. You have redeemed my life. In the midst of lament was hope. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was burned. The palace was burned. All the great buildings were burned. The walls were knocked down. The people were taken into slavery. If all you had was your eyes to give you evidence, you would have looked at it and said, the city is perished forever. The nation is gone for good. They've gone into captivity. This represents the end of the Jewish nation, of the Jewish state. This represents the end of the worship of the God of Israel. The temple of God is destroyed and gone. That was the way it looked. But you see, there was hope in the midst of lament. He describes that looking for redemption on beyond the catastrophe. And it was catastrophic. Here was a siege that lasted over 18 months. Here were large numbers of people literally starving to death. A horrible set of events and all of the things that happen. Calamity brings out both the best and the worst in people. And many times it brings out the worst as people in this state of siege would do terrible things to try to sustain their life regardless of whom it hurt. And so the situation goes on and on. Chapter 4, verse 1. How is the gold become dim? How is the most fine gold changed? The stones of the sanctuary are poured out in the top of every street. They're just used to fill in potholes. The stones of the temple. The stones that Solomon had cut, you remember? They were cut and quarried so that they exactly pre-fit, and there wasn't even the sound of a hammer that was heard at the temple building site. Now, those stones are broken up and cast out into the streets. The precious sons of Zion, comparable to fine gold, how are they esteemed as earthen pitchers, the works of the hand of the potter? Not only are the building blocks of Jerusalem thrown into the streets and used as landfill, but the precious sons of Zion. Instead of being viewed as valuable, they're just treated with the same indifference of an old clay pot. Describes in verse 4, the tongue of the suckling child cleaves to the roof of his mouth for thirst. The young children ask for bread, and no man breaks it unto them. You know, those that had been so dainty are desolate in the streets. Verse 6, the punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom that was overthrown as in a moment, and no hand stayed on her. You know, the punishment of Sodom didn't last very long. Just in a matter of a short time, they were burned up and it was over with very quickly. Here was something that lingered on for month after month. It describes the effects of the famine and people skin tone becoming dark as a result of the famine and the malnutrition, the skin cleaving to their bones, withered up, looking like a stick, as it says in verse 8. Well, verse 11 says, the Lord has accomplished His fury, He's poured out His fierce anger. Verse 12, the kings of the earth and all the inhabitants of the world would not have believed that the adversary and the enemy should have entered into the gates of Jerusalem. The sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests that have shed the blood of the just in the midst of her. Oh, the anger of God, verse 16, has been poured out. It has devoured the adversaries, devoured the sinners. Verse 17, as for us, our eyes yet failed for our vain help and our watching. We've watched for a nation that could not save us. You go through and read the story in 2 Kings and in the book of Jeremiah, and you'll find how Judah fixed their eyes on Egypt. They had made this alliance with Pharaoh Necho, and he was going to rescue them. And you watch, just watch. He's going to send his army, and everything's going to be okay, and we've got this deal made. And they were trusting in all the things they could see rather than in the invisible God. Verse 20 is interesting, chapter 4, verse 20. The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of the Lord, was taken in their pits, of whom we said, under His shadow we shall live among the nations. Now that probably is a reference back to Josiah, the anointed of the Lord. He was taken. He died. See, they'd been trusting, say, well, under His shadow we're going to live among the nations. Josiah's a young man. Remember, he reigned 31 years. That's a long time. But you have to realize he was only 8 when he became king. Josiah was 39 when he died. It would have been logical to have expected, why, he's a young man. He'll be around for years. Under His shadow, we're going to dwell safely among the nations. Well, everything's going to be okay. He'll be around for years. That's not going to happen. Well, the anointed of the Lord was taken away. And so then, verse 22, the punishment of your iniquity is accomplished, O daughter of Zion. Because the story doesn't end with their punishment. It goes on to punish those who punish them. Chapter 5 ends up, remember, O Lord, what has come upon us. Consider and behold our reproach. Our inheritance is turned to strangers, our houses to aliens. Verse 9, we obtain our bread with the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. Verse 15, the joy of our heart is ceased, our dance is turned into mourning, the crown is fallen from our heads. Woe unto us, we've sinned. For this our heart is faint, for these things our eyes are dim, because of the mountain of Zion which is desolate, the foxes walk upon it. You, O Lord, remain forever. Your throne from generation to generation. Here the throne of David, what was apparent and what was visible there in Jerusalem, the temple and the royal house ceased. The king was blinded and taken off captive to Babylon. There was no one sitting on the throne. The palace of David was burned to the ground. The temple of Solomon was burned to the ground. The priests were taken into captivity. It appeared that it was all over, the promises that God had made. And yet, God remains forever. His throne remains from generation to generation. It seemed like He was forgetting His people and forsaking them. Verse 21, turn us unto you, O Lord, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old. Give us a fresh opportunity, a fresh chance. Turn us unto you. You see, the solution was for the nation to turn to God. Now, when the question was asked of Zechariah and the priest Joshua and the other leaders there at the temple in 516 BC, for the last 70 years we've been lamenting here in the 5th month, this fast of the 5th month. We've read the book of Lamentations. We read it over and over. We read it every year. We fast every year. Is it time for us to stop? And in effect, Zechariah's answer was, you've never really started. Not from the heart. Not really turning to me. You haven't really been fasting to me. You've been doing it for yourself. You felt sorry for yourself that all these things had happened. Now the temple was beginning to be rebuilt. But you see, that wasn't the end of the story. Every year, beginning from the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, the Jewish community fasted on the 9th day of the 5th month. They read this prophecy, which by the time they had really started paying attention to it, had long since become history. That went on for centuries. And, of course, the temple was eventually rebuilt in the days of Zerubbabel. Jesus Christ came and walked in that temple. Matthew chapter 24, we read of one of the final times that Jesus Christ was in the temple complex. Matthew 24, verse 1. Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and His disciples came unto Him to show Him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, do you see all these things? Truly, I tell you, there's not going to be left here one stone upon another that are not going to be thrown down. Not only was the temple destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, centuries later, the temple was destroyed by Titus and the Romans. In fact, interestingly, coincidentally, whatever you want to say, it was destroyed on the exact anniversary. The Romans destroyed the temple on the 9th day of the 5th month, the anniversary of Nebuchadnezzar's destruction. It wasn't that they just sort of waited for that day. They besieged Jerusalem and finally broke in, and as they began their progress through the walls, or through the city, trying to, the final holding out place of the Jews was there in the temple complex. And Jesus made an interesting statement. He said, not one stone is going to be left standing on another. And that was literally fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. You see, the temple complex caught fire. They were trying to burn out the holdouts, and the temple complex caught fire. Well, much, of course, the timbers burned and the roof fell in and much of the thing collapsed, but you have to realize it was a stone edifice. There was a reason why every stone was cast down. The reason was that there was a tremendous amount of gold that was attached to various portions of the temple wall. You know what happened in the fire? The gold, of course, liquefied and it ran down between the cracks of the stones. The Roman soldiers wanted the gold. And so they literally cast down every stone from the other stones because they were trying to retrieve the gold that had melted and run down between them. And so Christ's prophecy was exactly fulfilled. Not one stone was left standing on another. You know, God has ways of getting things done. He didn't have to send an angel to command the Romans to, I want you to throw every stone down from on top of the others. If you'd have told them that, they'd have said it's too much work. Just let the gold melt and run down. You don't even have to tell them. They're out there. They don't care how much work it is. They're throwing the stones down, trying to get at the gold. So now, Jesus said, in answer to their question, He talked about not one stone left standing on another. The disciples said, tell us, when are these things going to be? What's going to be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus then began to answer them. Now it's interesting as you look at the story, because we see that there was a period of approximately 40 years, the approximate time of a generation, that God's message went out through Josiah and through Jeremiah to Jerusalem of that day, in the days of Babylonian attack. God's message, God's warning. You can read the book of Jeremiah and read about his interaction with the leaders and about his message to the common people. You can read, of course, of what Josiah himself did and the warnings he gave. The entire generation, there was a period of a generation that received that message. And they didn't listen. At least most of them didn't. In fact, it's interesting, the ones that really listened and took heed, God managed to get most of them out of Jerusalem. Daniel was hauled off to Babylon. He wasn't there to starve when the thing fell apart. Ezekiel was taken off to Babylon at a later time. Jeremiah was there, but God worked circumstances out to have somebody actually feed Jeremiah. At a time when he'd been left to die and to starve to death, there was an Ethiopian eunuch that had compassion on him and had respect for him and was allowed to take care of it there in the final days of the siege. But the point that I want to make is that when these terrible events, the horrible calamities that are described in detail in the book of Lamentations, the generation upon whom that came received a repeated message that they didn't listen to. Now, you remember when Jesus was being taken from the hall of judgment, taken out to be crucified? You remember the women lining the streets, and some of them were crying and carrying on, and Jesus looked at them and he said, "You daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me. You better weep for the city of Jerusalem and what's going to come to pass." There was a period again of another generation of approximately 40 years. That generation had the witness directly from Jesus himself and from the apostles that he taught. Over a period of approximately 4 decades, until the church finally fled Jerusalem, the siege was put around Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was destroyed the second time, only destroyed twice. The temple was only destroyed twice. What was destroyed in Christ's day was the second temple, the one that had been rebuilt in the days of Zerubbabel, the days of Zechariah. That temple was destroyed. And the events that are described in Lamentation, the prophecy that Jeremiah wrote about the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem, had one level of fulfillment in the days of Nebuchadnezzar and in the days of Jeremiah himself. But those words were fulfilled once again in 70 AD. Because what happened in 586 really was repeated once again in 70 AD. We have a first-hand account. Josephus was a Jewish historian in general. He was present. He saw it. He records a first-person account of the terrible things, and it's just like you're reading Deuteronomy 28 or the book of Lamentations. But that is not the end of the story either. Because Jesus clearly goes on in Matthew 24 to talk about something beyond just the time in the years ahead of him, the time period when the temple would be destroyed and the stones cast down. He went on to talk about the end of the age, the events that are going to culminate, as he describes in verse 30 of Matthew 24, when the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And all the tribes of the earth shall mourn, and they'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He'll send His angels with a great sound of a trumpet. And they'll gather together His elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So Matthew 24 talks about something of which the events of 70 AD were only a type. He talks about a time when, as we're told here in Matthew 24:21, then shall be great tribulation such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no nor ever again shall be. Except those days should be shortened, there would no flesh be saved alive. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Comes on down, culminating in the return of Christ. So as bad as the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, and the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem once again in 70, as bad as those events were, there is a time, Jesus said, that will be worse yet. He talks about in Matthew 24 certain things that were going to happen. He talks about his servants being hated of all nations, verse 9. He talked about verse 14, this gospel of the kingdom being preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, then shall the end come. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, when you see that standing in the holy place, you better understand. It's a time for those in Judea to flee, because it marks the onset of great tribulation. Now that happened in type in 70 AD, but clearly the context of Matthew 24 looks beyond 70 AD. It looks to the end time. Now let me ask you another question. Let's go back to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 4. Ezekiel went into captivity at the same time that King Jehoiakim did. And in fact, we're told here in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 2 that he's writing this prophecy in the fifth year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. King Jehoiakim went into captivity about 597, and it was in about 586 that the temple was destroyed. Ezekiel is writing these first few chapters about halfway between the time he had gone into captivity and the time Jerusalem would be destroyed. About halfway in. There was about a 10 or 11 year period in between, and he was writing at about year 5. And Ezekiel is in this community of Jewish captives by the river Kabar, which was a tributary of the Euphrates. And notice what he says in Ezekiel chapter 4. One day, God told him, He said, Ezekiel, I want you to go out and build a little model city. Take a piece of ceramic tile and mark it off and use it to represent the city of Jerusalem. And go and build fortifications around it and build siege. And so Ezekiel is out here in sort of this vacant lot. And pretty soon folks are coming up looking, what are you doing? What are you doing? And he makes a model of Jerusalem. And he makes a model of a siege against it, and little toy soldiers and everything. People are coming and looking. And so he has made a model of the siege of Jerusalem. And then he's told that you lay siege against it, in verse 3. Notice the very end of verse 3. This shall be a sign to the house of Israel. To the house of Israel. Did Ezekiel know the difference between Israel and Judah? Did Ezekiel just sort of use Israel and Judah to mean the same thing? Because it was Jerusalem that he made the model city of. At this point, the house of Israel had been in Assyrian captivity for well over a century. Over a century and a quarter by this time. Now, how could this be, and why would this be a sign to them? Well, you know that he meant what he said, because if you go right on down in chapter 4 and verse 4, Ezekiel was told, I want you to go out, God told him, He said, I want you to go out there every day and to lay on your left side, there by this little model city, to bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And I want you to lay out there for 390 days. That's a year and a month. Now, you know, just as an aside, this is a good evidence as to why you shouldn't bet even on what you think is a sure thing. You know, if you lived there in that little community and you'd seen Ezekiel go out there, he goes out there first day and he lays down, boy, that looks sort of strange. He's laying on his left side there by the city. This little model town. Well, the second day he goes out there and he lays down again. And he does it for a week and 2 weeks and a month goes by and 2 months and 6 months goes by. You know, by that time, you're figuring, you know, that's pretty predictable what Ezekiel's going to do. Boy, you can just set your clock by old Zeke. He comes out there every day and he just lays down on his left side right there by that little model city. He lays down there all day. 390 days Ezekiel goes out and he lays down. When day 391 came, what do you bet? People said, you know, what are the odds that Ezekiel is going to come out? Yep, he's coming. He's going to go and lay on his left side. We know that, boy. He's done that forever. But on day 391, Ezekiel didn't lay on his left side. He laid on his right side. Because God said, I want you to bear the iniquity of the house of Judah, verse 6, for 40 days. Appointed each day for a year. Ezekiel clearly knew the difference between Israel and Judah. He lay on his left side to represent Israel for 390 days. He lay on his left side, on his right side to represent Judah for 40 days. When Ezekiel said the siege of Jerusalem is a sign for the house of Israel, he clearly, in the context, knew the difference between Israel and Judah, and he was making a distinction between the two. In fact, if you go to Ezekiel 37, there are two visions recorded in Ezekiel 37. And the first is the familiar one that we often turn to, the valley of dry bones. But you can tell, you know when the breaks come in the book of Ezekiel. Here's the key, Ezekiel 37:15. The word of the Lord came again unto me, saying. This is sort of the operative phrase when Ezekiel received fresh messages. And most of the other prophets use the same phrase. By the way, this just is one little aside. When you read Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the other prophets, what you generally see is the message they recorded was in the order God gave it to. And they used this phrase, the word of the Lord came unto me saying, and the word of the Lord came unto me again saying. And they just wrote it down. But if you just go through and read Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, how do you follow the time flow of when these events are going to happen? The key is in the book of Revelation, where that puts everything together. That's why Revelation, which uses over 100 quotes and paraphrases from the Old Testament, drawing from all the prophets, weaves the themes together. Now, you pick up the second vision that Ezekiel had in Ezekiel 37:15, and he was told to take a stick and write on it for Judah. And then he was to take another stick and write on it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel, his companions. And so he was told to take these two sticks, one representing Ephraim and the other representing Judah. The two nations, or the two houses, Israel and Judah, to join them together and to make them one stick, because verse 22, God would make them one nation and He would set one king, David, over them. That's all future. Ezekiel knew the difference between Israel and Judah. And the events that happened to Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, Ezekiel said were a sign to the house of Israel. So the book of Lamentations, in a very direct, in its first and most in a literal fulfillment, a first fulfillment, prophesied what was going to happen to Judah after the time of Josiah's death, during the days of Jeremiah's prophecy. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple was destroyed. They went into captivity. That wasn't the end of the story, though, because years later, centuries later, in the aftermath of the death of Jesus. After the preaching of Jesus and His apostles, those in that generation who rejected that preaching saw a second fulfillment of exactly what was described in the book of Lamentations. Destruction of the nation that is described in the book of Lamentations. But that in itself was not the end of the story, because Jesus spoke of a time down in the end that would be worse than any other. And you see, these things that occurred to Jerusalem were a sign for the house of Israel. And the whole theme of Ezekiel's prophecies are the end times. So the book of Lamentations doesn't just talk about the past, it talks about the future. It's not just something that happened centuries ago when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem, or a few centuries later when Titus and the Romans invaded Jerusalem. It's a story of the future for the house of Israel. Just as in the days preceding Nebuchadnezzar's destruction, God raised up Jeremiah, He raised up a faithful king, Josiah, and there was a period of preaching and teaching and warning before that generation was visited with judgment. So also, before the second time of that judgment being visited, Jesus Himself and His disciples taught and preached, gave a warning. And so also as we come down to the end time, we come down to the time before the final fulfillment of those prophecies recorded in Lamentations. There is also a warning message, a message that has to go out. Jesus said, "This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world for a witness. Then shall the end come." God does not visit His judgment on a people that have not been warned. You know, Daniel talked about the end time. He talked about the events of the time of the end. Mentions that phrase in Daniel 11:35 and on down in Daniel 11:40. He mentions events in the Middle East. He mentions things that chapter 12 verse 1 that culminate with the time. At that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which stands for the children of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation to that same time. And at that time your people shall be delivered. At that time, the time that Michael stands up, at the close of this time of trouble worse than any other, your people shall be delivered. It's also a time when those asleep will begin to awaken. First, there are those who awaken to everlasting life, and then there are also those who awaken to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel was told, verse 4, "Shut up the word, seal the book, even to the time of the end." Many will run to and fro, and knowledge will be increased. Daniel wanted to understand how long all these things were going to go on. He was told that there would be a period in verse 7 of time, times, and half a time. And he still didn't understand, and he was told in verse 9, "Go your way, the words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end." We're living in that time when knowledge is being increased and men are running to and fro. We're living in the time of the greatest transportation revolution and knowledge explosion in the history of humanity. We're living at that time of the end. We're living in the days that are the prelude to the fulfillment of this prophetic message. You know, the Jews are still going through the motions of commemorating the anniversary of the temple's destruction. And interestingly, several other events following on the same anniversary. That was the date that the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. It was the date that Hitler launched the Holocaust. As the centuries have passed, there have been additional reasons added on top of this particular anniversary. The book of Lamentations doesn't just point to the past, though. It points to the greatest time of trouble that's ever going to come. A time that you and I, living in the prelude to that time, a time that you and I have a part of taking a message to the world, of taking a message to the house of Israel, of pointing out the things that are going to come, of being a part of sounding a message, just as Jeremiah did, just as the apostles did, and as we're having a part of that in our day. But in the midst of lament, there's hope. Because on beyond that time comes the sound of the trumpet and the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. A time when the dead will be raised, the dead in Christ. A time when those that are asleep will awaken. That time is in the years immediately ahead of us.